Hi, this is Patrick Heffernan. I'm the professional services and IT services practice manager and principal analyst at Technology Business Research. And for the last couple of months, we've been having roundtable sessions on what's happening with the vendors that we cover and what's happening to the IT services and the software and cloud and all the technology markets generally in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So today we're actually going to focus on acquisitions. And I've got two of my colleagues, Boz Christoph and Alan Kranz, here with me to talk about the companies that they cover and the continued pace of acquisitions, or maybe the lack thereof, in the space that's been going on over the last few months. And we're going to start off by talking to Boz because I know that Accenture, who he covers, has always maintained a very high cadence, a high pace, constant acquisition strategy, and they've always set aside a lot of money every year to do that. But I'm wondering if that has changed at all in this pandemic. So, Boz, where's Accenture right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point you're raising, Patrick, regarding Accenture's acquisition spend. And just like for the last 5 years, Accenture had set aside a significant chunk of change for fiscal year 20 to spend $1.6 billion on the acquisition spend, which is more or less in line with what they've been spending for the last few years. Number of transactions, 20 to 30 transactions a year. Even more than that. So it's really, something that the company really has not slowed down regardless of COVID. So when they reported their 1Q20 calendar 1Q20 or fiscal second quarter of their fiscal year in March, COVID had just started impacting everyone in regards to business and people's lives, and just overall it was just getting, everything was just getting halted at that point. So Accenture made a really forward-looking statement in terms of the acquisition spend that at that point they had committed already at $1.1 billion out of this 1.6, and they were looking forward to spend another $500 million. And since then, they have. That was end of March. Now we're at the end of May, so 2 months later, they have done another 8 transactions, and they have completed another 2 previously announced transactions. So 10 acquisitions within the span of 2 months, and I'll probably expect to hear a few more before the end of their fiscal year ends at the end of August. No surprise, certainly a company that is coming a lot from a position of strength. Their capital allocation policy and how they look into acquisitions have really augmented not just their capabilities, how they do things in what they call the new, like security and digital and cloud, but have really played a critical role into the R&D spend. So it's really kind of a way for them to augment the R&D, because many of the acquisition so they pursue, they acquire the IP, they acquire the skill sets and blend a lot of the IP into the bigger Accenture machines that helps them to develop their own assets, which they can then deploy and certainly go to scale later on. The acquisitions that they've done kind of fit the profile for the most part into what the company have been going through the last few years in terms of areas of investments, such as big data analytics, Industry X.0, cybersecurity, skills in certified cloud resources like AWS, digital marketing services. So all areas that have been really part of Accenture's acquisition strategy over the last couple of years, and really helped the company pivot to what they are executing in so-called the new strategy for the firm. The only acquisition that's really kind of, I would say, partially COVID related or opportunity as a result of COVID was the Cates Kessler acquisition out of New York. So it's more of an organizational design and kind of fits into their human and organization, talent and organization unit for the company. So that was something that we don't often hear, but sort of not surprising considering the climate right now and the opportunities that are around HR transformation. But the rest of the components like By Prophecy, like big data analytics, Callisto integration, Industry X.0, POM systems, product lifecycle management, Industry X.0, all really fit the profile of that, building what the company has put forward as a goal to start being, like investing and trying to gain foothold in new areas like product engineering services or cybersecurity and whatnot. So again, they are staying the course of the acquisition strategy. Certainly not so, not taking the foot off the pedal of the gas in terms of like spending. I'm sure there'll be a lot more bargains out there after the COVID debates. So I wouldn't be surprised if Accenture continues to even accelerate further into the fiscal year 2021 starting September 1st.
That's so crazy, though, to say that they made 10 acquisitions in 2 months, as though those were normal 2 months. Those were abnormal 2 months by any kind of the stretch of the imagination. So that they continued at a pace is really kind of remarkable. So, Alan, in the cloud and software space, is there anything similar, or is it a lot of other players taking smaller risks or making smaller acquisitions?
Yeah, I agree with Boz. I don't think on the cloud and software side there's been pronounced change for companies that were acquiring before. They've continued with a lot of that activity. And when we look at what some of the companies that are being acquired do and provide, it's definitely not a short-term reaction in terms of the changes brought about by COVID. I think it reinforces the idea that there's going to be phases, and the return to pre-2020 environment is not going to happen in the short term. So there are things that help now, but also are part of a longer term strategy that will have benefits over time. And so some of the examples, some of the kind of categories, if you look at the acquisitions, starting with kind of network focused software vendors. So Microsoft's acquired 2 network focused companies. Palo Alto Networks acquired CloudGenix, focused on SD-WAN. And so part of that is also, it's tied into 5G in a lot of ways. So that's an ongoing trend, but one, again, that's changed as a result of the shifts with COVID. It may not be as remote for most employees as it is today, and it has been over the past 2 months in terms of their work location and habits, but it will be more remote. And so the network portion is important. Verizon acquired BlueJean Networks. Again, there's a big short-term push around collaboration, video conference calls, all those remote enabling technologies. So it helps a little bit in the short term, but it's also part of a longer term strategy around enabling things like telemedicine and new use cases that will emerge to help with the long-term transition back to a new normal and deal with the multiple phases of change brought about by COVID. Some of the other, and then there's ongoing acquisitions. Some of them, started a little bit early in terms of like the February timeline, but have progressed, even though they're quite significant investments. So it was a big deal when Koch Industries closed the acquisition of Infor, which is very industry focused SaaS provider, ties into Koch's big presence and knowledge of manufacturing, but again is part of those movements to cloud in more traditional, slower to change industries like manufacturing have been at play for quite some time, and the pandemic really just kind of increases some of the urgency. But accelerates the pace. But again, it's not something where it wouldn't have happened if the pandemic hadn't had the effects that it has. So that's a very significant transaction, north of $10 billion, even though the specific estimate hasn't been disclosed since it is private. Another kind of big deal. So Intel is, obviously at the core of all things IT, and has grown a stake in terms of the autonomous car market, starting with a acquisition of Mobileye back in 2017, again, estimated around $15 billion. So big purchase. And then they just augmented that with another significant investment in a company called Move It that helps with some of the logistics and guidance for things like autonomous cars, virtual taxis, driverless taxis. All of that is part of, again, a long-term strategy. And for bigger companies like Accenture, like Intel, like Microsoft, they're going to continue to invest in those long-term initiatives, despite the short-term disruption that's occurring to their businesses. Because if you're stable enough, if you have enough cash on hand, it's a good time to continue to invest to increase that competitive advantage as we start to get back to economic growth and get more of the world's economies up and running, which is an ongoing challenge. But in the short term, they're going to continue to grow their strategies and continue them, although slightly adjusted because of the pandemic. Again, it's not. I don't see a lot of short-term overreactions in terms of going out and focusing on investments that are really only relevant for phase one or two, the earlier phases of the transition back to a more normal world and society because of the pandemic.
So, Alan, let me ask you a question on that, because when you started, you talked about network-focused acquisitions, and a lot of that was tied to people working from home more, the huge spike in remote work and all that, and that kind of makes sense. But if the expectation is that this working remote is going to become something that everyone does much more frequently and much more at a much larger scale than in the past, then are those acquisitions that were made, were they sort of the early acquisitions and what's going to become a rush to build up capacity and capability around this? Or is that maybe going to fade off a bit as we all get used to whatever this looks like going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are going to be things that have long-term benefits. So if you look at some of Microsoft's acquisitions, being able to extend their cloud data centers out to the edge and leveraging some of the telecom networks that are both in place today, as well as the promised availability of 5G in the near future. That's part of a long-term strategy. It will help with the continued heightened remote work situation, but also set them up for a lot of those new use cases around 5G that it's been a decade type investment around autonomous cars and smart cities and all the things that we've been thinking about in terms of edge computing, 5G, bringing those things together with intelligence at the edge to do things previously not possible, given the latency issues and the lack of sensors and all the analytics needed to make them happen. So I think it will have benefits for definitely increasing the bandwidth for continued remote work, but also get to some of the more exciting new use cases that have been thought about for a while, but just haven't come to fruition as of yet.
And so, Alan, you mentioned 5G a couple times, and Boz, I know you're right on the edge of publishing some new analysis around 5G in the context of digital transformation. So were any of Accenture's 10 acquisitions, were they at all related to 5G, or do you see anyone out there that's any of the services vendors or the consultancies that are making moves right now to take advantage of what's very likely going to be an increase in well, they can't be an increase in hype, but an increase in activity around 5G?
Yeah, the 10 that they just did, none of them was directly connected to 5G in terms of the networking. They did an acquisition, just can't recall the name of it right now. It was about 6 or 9 months ago. Like I said, they acquired so many companies. That was out in Sweden, if I'm not mistaken. That was exactly in that direction. So they have put some groundwork in the 5G domain from an acquisition standpoint. And they have also unveiled some of their own portfolio offerings around 5G and from assessment to tooling to managed services. They have a whole portfolio of 5G services that fits that profile. But Accenture has been acquiring mainly horizontal capabilities. So as they are trying to go through the changes of their business model in terms of how they operate from a industry aligned capabilities, industry aligned P&L to more of a geocentric P&L, and increased focus on building cross-industry collaboration with the emphasis on horizontal areas like product engineering services, Industry X.0, digital marketing, interactive security. I can see how 5G, from a technology standpoint, could start to kind of emerge a little bit more aggressive, because previously those acquisitions they've done were kind of coming through their CMT group, their communication, media, and telecom group. So that's now kind of like that group as a organizational structure has been kind of more spread out on a geo level and more of a horizontal capability. So I can see, as a next wave almost, or at least in some pockets, some geographies that they can go after and acquire certain assets, resources, and whatnot. But none of those 10 have been in the 5G arena, but wouldn't be surprised if they start picking up more as 5G kind of becomes more of a reality, essentially, and start becoming, and companies start to build use cases around it. They're a little more tangible, more so than just being a hype and talk around speed and connectivity.
Right. And as we've talked about before, it's the use cases that are really going to make a difference when it comes to adoption of an emerging technology like that. So I want to ask both who should be acquiring right now and doesn't seem to be. And by that, I mean, given the macroeconomic conditions, given the opportunity to potentially buy assets relatively cheaply, and given the opportunity to take a sort of a bold step at a time when everybody is real concerned. So are there vendors out there that are not taking actions that you think should be? But before we get to that, I'm really curious about one thing, Boz. You said that very few of Accenture's acquisitions were COVID related. Broadening that out, have you seen any other acquisitions from any of the other IT services vendors or the consultancies that you look at that have been really specific to reacting to or taking care of the back end of this pandemic?
Nothing off the top. I haven't seen anyone that says, well, we're grabbing, a great bargain and we see something that's going to help us to drive services within a particular area like HR transformation or cloud or cybersecurity. I mean, I think, we have to watch out for RegTech, regular technology, in a way of like is an area that we may see some increase. I think actually one of the Accenture's acquisitions was in that particular area out of Italy, kind of all places, kind of like, something to keep in mind for. I think they did 2 acquisitions out of Italy. And again, I don't think they just bought those companies as a result of what's happening in Italy for the last 2 months. They certainly have done their homework prior to that, but just coincidentally, it's something to consider. But I haven't heard anybody else that have done something that is COVID specific or as a result of COVID to try to think about and invest more aggressively.
Yeah, that makes sense. And two out of the 10 in Italy is a bit surprising. But as we were talking about before, that's also because these were planned well in advance of the pandemic getting. So before we get to the who should be acquiring and isn't right now, Alan, I have one more question for you, because you mentioned autonomous vehicles and driverless taxis, and I'm just curious, in your opinion, if there's an acceleration in the adoption of these technologies to bring autonomous vehicles and driverless taxis to a larger scale than anticipated, say, a year ago or 6 months ago, does that have an impact on the business model for the cloud vendors, the software vendors, for the technology vendors? Does an accelerated adoption pace make a difference in the way that they monetize their assets and they get something and they see the return on that investment?
Yeah, it definitely does. And that whole space is interesting because obviously we have much less desire to travel than historically. So you see a lot of rental car companies under tremendous pressure, and taxis in the same way. So there's decreased demand, but also If there were a way to do it totally autonomously with no driver, that removes a lot of the issue around social distancing and not putting drivers at risk, as well as passengers. So it's unclear which way it's going to go, but certainly going forward, that's part of the long tail. As people get out more, if there's ways to, with fewer cars on the road overall, less folks riding public transportation, could be an opportunity to accelerate some of those things. And it does put pressure on, getting the network in place, getting the compute and all of the infrastructure, as well as the software platforms, to be able to get that up and running. So I think that's one of those longer term, mid to long term changes that cloud vendors are going to look very closely at, and could end up being an opportunity if the conditions are right, in terms of the public, the regulations, and the transportation ecosystem, could accelerate, or certainly the driverless taxis, but it could also, there could be other changes that we haven't seen yet as a result of everything.
Right, and I think the expectations are so much higher now with autonomous vehicles and driverless taxis and all that, because for the last few years it seemed like there was progress being made, and then if you take that sort of building up of the hype and then you add the condition we're in right now, where I have to say, Alan, I definitely have a desire to travel. I just don't want to travel with any other people. So there's a challenge there, I guess. But I can see that becoming, I can see there being a greater interest in sort of seeing that technology develop and be deployed much faster now because of the situation we're in. So Alan, just the last question here. Is there a company, a vendor you can think of that you're surprised hasn't been making acquisitions during this time?
Yeah, I mean, Google closed a big acquisition with Looker recently, just kind of as the pandemic started, but haven't seen a tremendous amount out of them as of yet. They have really big growth ambitions for cloud. Obviously, things are a little bit more in flux with the onset of the pandemic. It would make sense for a company with a lot of money, with the expectation to really advance their position in the cloud infrastructure market, to be more aggressive going forward. So definitely look for that. As well as, I think Microsoft they've made a couple spot acquisitions to fill in portfolio areas around networking and 5G, but, could be, again, someone that participates in a more aggressive way, as they have throughout the past couple of years, to really expand on their position. And of all the companies that I cover, I think the biggest net beneficiary of a lot of the changes, at least so far in terms of COVID, and so are pretty financially able to continue to either maintain pace or increase the aggressiveness with which they acquire.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we think about them, to Bos's point about regulatory tech and sort of how the impact will be felt within the both regulated industries, but also the environments. We think about that, the sort of the impact that companies like Microsoft and Google and Amazon can have on the regulatory. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch as well. I mean, they're the biggest players with the loudest voice in Washington on matters of technology, so just despite what people might think about the choices they make. So then, Bos, the same question to you with respect to who is not active that you think should be right now, or you're surprised isn't more active right now.
I want to say I'm surprised, but I think maybe it's an opportunity for India-centric vendors to really make the leap into the efforts to become more of a transformation partners and start to build their, business consulting kind of acumen, trying to build some more stronger relationships with the C-suite. I mean, they're very good at IT. They're very good to provide service on the supply side, but they are really, still trying to close that gap. and that's how been perceived by the enterprises, the buyers. So for them to be able to make that change, it's a good opportunity to start looking into where can they close the gap. Is it within particular industry, if it's within particular domain area that they feel strong that they can extend into their IT later on. But certainly, I think a lot falls into on their culture. As we know, for the most part, they really prioritize margin first culture, and it takes a while to make a large strategic buy, a large buy. If we go back in time, after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, TCS pulled the trigger on a $500 million acquisition of the Citigroup Global Business Services. That kind of helped them to create the whole financial services and kind of in the BPO arena. That business is now $2.5 billion, 9.5, 10 years later, right? So it took a while to get that return, but certainly a large. So TCS did not pursue very many acquisitions in the meantime. I think the first acquisition since then was a couple of years, less than 2 years, like couple of small design shops out of Europe. So just an example of like opportunities that may come out as a result of COVID, and how I think the India-centric vendors, if they really want to be a transformation partners, maybe a good time for them to depart or at least carefully rebalance that margin first culture and be a little bit more aggressive. Integration of a largest acquisition that may not be fitting their culture profile, that's another story. But at least they can try and see where they may want to place their bets from a kind of trying to close the gap on the spectrum of services. The other part, on the other side of the spectrum, obviously the management consultancies, they all aspire to start build their technology chops. And we know they start picking and choosing smaller acquisitions along the way, in particular technologies like SAP or Salesforce and whatnot. But I think for them, it's a matter of time now to decide, do they want to strategically partner with someone like, the Infosys of the world and have a more established go-to-market versus trying to buy someone like at that scale, at that tier, to be able to have more of a cohesive go-to-market value proposition.
Yeah, Boz, I'm glad you mentioned the India-centric vendors, because I think, my position is you should always stick to what you do well. That's sort of guiding philosophy point number one. The other one is consulting is hard, and everyone tries to do not everyone. When people try to do consulting that aren't consultants, it doesn't often work. And we've seen over the years the India-centric vendors do both those things, make both those mistakes, wander away from both those principles. And yet, at the same time, when I think to a year ago, when we were looking at the India-centric vendors, saw it was hard to distinguish between them. Looked like everything was being so commoditized that we were wondering which one of the largest of them could survive as the market sort of peeled away from them. Well, through this pandemic, if there's ever an opportunity to take that huge leap and acquire a consultancy and shift your business model, if you're TCS or HCL or Infosys or whatever, to really make that dramatic change through an acquisition, through a complete change in the way you go to the market, and to actually embrace a consulting-led approach in a truly different way. This is obviously the best time to do it because, hell, we're in a pandemic, so why not? And I guess that goes against the things I've always preached before, but again, we're in a pandemic, so all bets are off. All right, gentlemen, thanks very much. Alan, any last thoughts before we close out?
No, I mean, I really do believe that the stronger firms, the larger firms, will use this as an opportunity to continue to advance their competitive position, and they may make some adjustments in terms of where they're going, but a lot of these things are just long-term trends that have been exemplified and amplified as part of the pandemic.
Yeah, I completely agree. Boz, any other thoughts?
No, I mean, certainly a lot to look for. Let's see how vendors, they are taking a little bit of a holiday from Wall Street in regards to like not providing revenue and margin and earnings per share guidance, so to speak. So
Right.
That could give them a little bit of a flexibility to see how they want to maybe change their capital allocation policies and how much they really want to stay and say, you know what, let's not share as much dividends to our shareholders or share back cash, free cash flow, but maybe try to pull the trigger on something that's going to give us a long-term strategic bet that will pay off with higher returns in the long term.
Yeah, and that point, and you tied that, Boz, with what Alan was saying about trends. And I think from the very beginning, we've tried to look at the impacts of COVID-19 as what are the trends that are actually going to stick through, and what are the things that are going to matter more on the other side of the pandemic. And M&A is not going to go away. Some of the activities that we've been talking about today, particularly with respect to Accenture and their continued voracious acquisition appetite, is still going to stay even after the pandemic. So we'll see what it all means. Thank you, gentlemen. And with that, we'll close this last roundtable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.